Hey everybody, welcome to Xark Labs. I'm Xark, this is my lab. So happy to have you here today. I created this channel because after 42 years as a game developer, I've worked on a lot of platforms and a lot of titles, and I have some stories that I thought people might find interesting. I've also worked on various retro and neo-retro projects, and so I want to talk about those too at some point. Today I want to talk about my origin story, or how I got started in electronics and computers and lasers, and then eventually I got a call and they offered me a full-time game development job when I was 17. So let's get started. So I've been super lucky to have been a game developer for 42 years, from 1981 to 2023 when I retired. And during that time, the whole game industry was really growing up itself. In the early 80s, it wasn't clear game development was going to be like an actual career. And, now fast forward to 2023, game development's huge, bigger than movies and music combined. But back then, that wasn't clear that was going to be the case. I was just super enthusiastic about it and basically got lucky. And so I thought I'd tell the story about how I got into computers at such an early period and basically was lucky enough to get a game development job at the age of 17 when they called me. So first off, I want to say I'm not particularly special. I mean, I'm pretty smart, but I'm not crazy smart. If I have any superpower, it's that I'm persistent / stubborn, kind of two sides of the same coin. And I have the kind of mind where I'm, distracted by all kinds of things, but when I focus on something, I can really focus on it. And so, that's the kind of geeky, nerdy mindset that works well with computers. I first got into electronics when my mom, for I believe a birthday, gave me a 10-in-1 electronics kit. The kind where you bend the little spring, stick in the wire, and then you can build at least 10 circuits. I feel like I built a lot more than 10 out of my kit. And so that was really interesting to me. And so I was like, wow, this electronics is cool. And so I started reading a lot about that. I got more kits and was building crystal radios and all that kind of stuff. That was at around the age of, 10 or 11. I started really getting into that. So fast forward to around 76 or so, I'm living with my aunt in North Hollywood in an apartment, still into electronics. Now I was getting more into TTL electronics and 555, blinking LEDs, playing a lot with logic gates, AND gates, OR gates, this kind of stuff. The beginnings of what you need to make a computer. That said, computers were way too advanced for my little brain at the time, and there was no information about how to make a computer that was accessible to me at the time. While I was living with my aunt, one day she invited me to go with her to a recorder rehearsal session. I'm like, what? Why would I do that? Well, it turns out there was another kid there that she thought I might like to meet. He had a huge Lego collection, and plus his dad owned a computer company, and so he had a computer. And so I was like, what? Okay, sure, I'll go check it out. A fateful decision. So I went over there, met this kid whose name was also Ken, and became best friends. And so we were playing with Legos. I was asking him, so does your computer play chess? Because the only computer I knew of at that point was the one on the Star Trek, the original series, that Spock used to play chess with. He laughed and was like, no, computers don't play chess. But hey, I'll load up a game for you. And he proceeded to show me his micro-kit computer that was his father's company. It had dual Panasonic tape decks, a Panasonic TV that was converted to be used as a monitor. And so he loaded up a game called, I believe, Torpedo. And it was basically an ASCII art version of the arcade game Seawolf, where you had little submarines and boats that would travel by at various speeds, and you would hit spacebar to fire torpedoes up from the bottom of the screen, and you'd have to time it right to hit the submarines and the other boats. The torpedoes were little exclamation points, and the boats were dashes and slashes. But it all animated very smoothly. I think it was written in, 8080 assembly language or something, and it was amazing. So basically this game was, at home you had like the Atari, but this was like, wow, almost like an arcade game on this guy's computer. Became best friends with Ken, and I would come over and hang out, almost every day after school. And we would build electronics in his garage and also hang out, play with his computer. He was always getting new programs from his father's work, and as well as the computers he would have from his father's company kept getting better and better. His father's computer company was renamed from Microkit to Future Data and got, fancy new cases and everything. Those computers were mostly used by other companies to build computers, so kind of like a development computer. Eventually, my friend Ken got an Apple II computer that I believe his father bought because he was, interested in the computer industry. But we used it to play early computer games. I remember Apple Galaxian, Alien Rain, I think it was called, and some other very early games. And so that was pretty cool. And then not too long after that, my aunt decided she needed an Apple II so she could work on her UCLA dissertation. And she talked my grandfather into giving her a chunk of change to buy this Apple II for college purposes. Well, this was awesome for me. So all of a sudden I had access to a computer where I was living. And, other than when she was working on her dissertation, I was on that Apple II, all the time. At that point, I went back to living with my father, and I had severe computer withdrawal. After spending all my time on a computer, I was now living with my dad in his apartment with no computer, and nobody I knew even had one. So I was like begging, like, please get me a computer. An Apple II was just not going to happen. My dad was not doing that well with some serious tax debt, and so I had to find an inexpensive computer. And so I remember scouring the back pages of all the computer magazines, trying to figure out what computer I could get. And so the two that I found that were maybe affordable was the Quest Super Elf 1802 system. That was only like $150. But then I was like, but there's this other computer, the Ohio Scientific Challenger 1P, that's got 4K of memory, a 6502 like the Apple II, a video display like the Apple II. You can load and save programs to cassette like the Apple II. And it even had Microsoft Basic and ROM, which the Apple II Plus had. So I think I made it clear to my dad, hey, I really want this, at the time, pretty expensive computer. I feel like the Ohio Scientific was $350 back then in 1978. But my father agreed to get me that in conjunction with my grandmother and my aunt for both birthday and Christmas present, pulling out all the stops because I needed a computer. That was awesome. Got that computer, set up my new computer, pretty much monopolized the television in my dad's apartment. Luckily, I was able to get my friend Ken to give me a computer monitor, an older one that was from his father's company. So I had a Panasonic television that was converted to be a black and white monitor that was awesome. And so I wrote all kinds of programs for this. The one I remember most was a port of an arcade game called Laser Command, where you had a bunch of white tanks and then your enemy had a bunch of black tanks, and the first person to shoot all of the other person's tanks would win. And if the tank you were in was shot, your little invulnerable command module would just have to walk over and get in another tank, and start, continue playing. In the arcade game, this was character graphics, so it mapped well to the Ohio Scientific. And I had Atari joysticks essentially soldered onto keys of the keyboard, and so that allowed you to have joystick control of the computer. And that was kind of a common modification for the Ohio Scientific computers back then. So I was in high school, had this Laser Command on my computer, and I would invite my friends over, and they would come over after school and basically have Laser Command battles and drink beer and do other stuff like that. But then they would offer ideas about, wow, it should be cool if you could shoot through the walls. And I would program all week, and next weekend when they would come over, maybe after a couple shots you could chip away and shoot through the walls. And so that was an early game development experience where I really enjoyed realizing the vision of my friends by programming the code. So I was playing with my Ohio Scientific computer at home. At high school, they had a room full of computers, TRS-80s and Commodore PETs, but you weren't allowed to use those computers because they were reserved for remedial education for students who needed to catch up. However, one of the counselors there had the bright idea of making me a teacher's assistant for that class. So I was able to basically have a period of school where I could just play with this room full of computers. And then also my grandmother, who was involved in the school board, got me hooked up with another teacher in the school district who was a very early advocate of using computers to teach children. I struck a deal with her where she gave me a PET 2001 8K with a printer and some other stuff if I would write software for the school district. And so that seemed totally cool. And that was similar to what I had been doing in the class for the high school. So now I was doing it for the whole school district. Meanwhile, my aunt, who had gotten the Apple II to work on her dissertation, got a little distracted by the whole computer thing. And she also decided that, hey, these computers would be great for teaching kids. And so she wanted to open up a little school and basically teach children how to program computers, something like 6 or 8 computers to set up in a schoolroom in the back of the house in North Hollywood. Again, I'm like 16 years old at that point. My aunt starts this school up. I come out to visit her and decide, yeah, I'm just going to stay here in this house that's filled with, has a room full of computers. And so I was going to teach at her school. My father had a good big picture view about, well, I should be in high school, but this computer stuff seems to be working out for me, and I can always get a GED later. So he was okay with letting me teach for my aunt at her school. So her school started. We had quite a few students come in, mostly younger kids, and we would program in BASIC and write simple games and Mad Lib programs and stuff like that. At one point, an older student came in, a fellow Howard. He wanted to learn how to program, and talking to him a bit more, what he wanted to program laser light shows, which is like, what? Well, apparently he had a friend who was into electronics who had built a card for the Apple II that could control a laser, basically move little mirrors so that you can, draw pictures on the wall with the laser and have the computer control it. He had some prototype software, but his idea was he was going to learn how to program and make a laser performance software so he could use this computer and actually perform laser light shows with it. That never happened. But he invited me over to see his laser setup. And while I was there, I met another programmer, Eric, who I already knew because I had met him working at Computerland. And I remembered because not only was he working at Computerland, he was writing Apple II computer games behind the counter. So right away, I knew this guy knew his stuff. And Howard had hired him to basically do the preliminary laser software, but he didn't really want to do the whole project. He had a day job and too much other stuff going on. However, I got talking to him, and so it's like, well, maybe this Ken guy can actually continue on and do this laser programming. It seemed pretty challenging to me at the time. I barely knew 6502, and I had not really written anything very significant in it. But I knew the basics of it, and this seemed like a good excuse to get good at it. So I took over the laser torch and wrote the first version of the laser performance software for Bifrost laser systems. And that worked out pretty cool. And so, basically you would have tables of sine waves and triangle waves and stuff in memory, step through them at different speeds on the X and Y axis and make different geometric patterns. You could have small little images, like little icons that you could move around. And so if you did that and then danced it around with the joystick to the music, it was like a laser light show. And you would have other effects, the so-called beam show, where there would just be mirrors that would, make the laser crisscross around over the room and stuff like that. And so I actually got, he operated the laser performance software, but I would often go to these gigs with him, help him set up and make sure everything worked, debug stuff on the fly. The most notable one I remember was he got a gig to do an effect for the movie 2010, the Arthur C. Clarke movie. And so I wrote custom software to fake this laser hand scan. And then I actually was on the 2010 set and got to be there while they actually filmed this sequence. And so that was an amazing thing for a young kid to be on the set of a movie theater with all the actors and in the green room and so on. Unfortunately, the laser wasn't bright enough for the film, and so that effect ended up getting cut, and they ended up putting just a CRT with the guy's hand on it in the final movie, but it was still tons of fun. So that's how I got the basic skills that I needed for game development. And so I continued working on Howard's laser performance software and continued helping teach at my aunt's computer workshop. And then one day, out of the blue, got a call from a fellow Bob from a company, McToy, who offered me $10 an hour to write video games full-time for the Atari 2600. And at the time, minimum wage was something like $3.35, so $10 an hour seemed like a fortune. One little problem, I don't have a car and I don't know how to drive, and so I don't know how I'm going to get from North Hollywood to Santa Monica every day for this job. No problem, Bob says. He offered to have me picked up and dropped off every day, or him or an employee. So cool, sign me up. I thought I might want to write video games someday, but I wasn't sure how I was going to get a job without going through college and, basically not doing well at school and whatnot. Got a call out of the blue. The reason why they called me is because Eric, who Howard was working with, this was his day job. He was writing 2600 games for McToy. And so when they asked him, hey, do you know anybody else who can write games? He didn't know too many other kids who knew 6502 assembly, I guess. So he gave them my name, and that's why they called me at 17, and I got my first game dev job. Tell you a little bit about the job. So McToy was called that because they had been doing kind of digital toys before video games. The most notable one was the NTEX Adventure Vision. They also had done a couple of Atari 2600 games that nobody's heard of because they were never released, like a Dr. Pepper game, and then another game for 20th Century Fox that was supposed to go with a movie called Heart Like a Wheel, a racing game. The movie didn't do well, so they canned the game, even though it was mostly completed. But the reason why they called me was because they had a new round of contracts they were going to get from Sega of El Segundo. And Sega had several popular arcade games, and they wanted a version made for home computers. Now, they called me in to work on the 2600, and that's what they said the job was going to be. I spent the first, several weeks while I was there studying the 2600 and playing around, trying to get screens up and so on. But they probably wisely decided, let's let Eric do the 2600 since he has experience on that system, and we'll let Ken do the Atari 400, 800, because I had a little bit of experience from that system from my aunt's computer workshop, but also because the 2600 is just kind of brutal to throw a newbie at. It's a notoriously primitive system. It would have been a challenge, but I'm pretty thankful I got the 400, 800. However, Sega, it was going to be an 8K ROM cartridge, but Sega said it had to work on 8K of RAM Ataris. So I was limited to 8K of RAM, which unfortunately wasn't quite enough for the highest quality double buffered graphics. That said, I think I made a few technical blunders on my first game. So despite some issues, I went on to ship Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom for the Atari 400, 800 from Sega in 1982. Also went on to make the Atari 5200 version, very similar. I'll make another video about the details of developing that game on a 4 MHz Z80 shared with 5 other programmers. all on serial terminals. Fun times. Right on. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to have more stories, and please leave comments if you have any questions, and you can email me at xark@xarklabs.com. Take it easy.